The soldier drops her canteen. Water splashes across her boots, but she doesn't notice. She stares at his jaw, his throat, the breadth of his shoulders under a rough-spun coat, and doesn't understand what she's seeing. No living woman on the continent has ever seen an adult man. But let's rewind. The mountain village of Yeomra sits in a fold of rock so deep that sunlight touches the rooftops for only 3 hours a day. 46 people live here, all women, all old or getting old. They grow bitter root vegetables, trade dried herbs with the valley below once a season, and exist in perfect silence. No soldiers come, no tax collectors, no priests. The empire forgot Yeomra the way a body forgets a dead fingertip. And that is exactly why Kang Ih-hyeon is still alive. He learned to walk without sound before he learned to speak. His mother taught him that. His grandmother taught him to breathe shallow when strangers passed on the trail below. 23 years, his entire existence, a secret kept by 2 women who understood one truth. A boy who is seen is a boy who dies. 50 years ago, the waning hit the continent of Erevin, a slow poison with no cure and no logic. Infant boys turned blue in their cribs. Teenagers bled from their eyes and stopped breathing in their sleep. Grown men withered like plants ripped from soil. Generation after generation, the curse chewed through bloodlines until there was simply no one left to bury. The world didn't collapse. The world adapted. Women took the swords, the crowns, the temple bells. 8 kingdoms merged into the Solenn Empire under a single throne, a throne that now sits empty because the last emperor died with no heir. 8 queens rule 8 territories and meet once a decade to pretend they still share a country. The balance holds because no one has a reason to break it. Until now. The imperial patrol rides into Yeomra at dawn. 6 mounted soldiers in silver blue armor. They're not looking for Ihyeon. They're tracking a smuggler moving unlicensed healing crystals through the northern passes. A village of old women. Root cellars, drying racks, nothing of interest. One soldier dismounts to refill her canteen at the well. That's when Ihyeon comes around the corner carrying firewood. He doesn't see her. She doesn't expect him. 4 paces of frozen mud between them, and the entire history of Erevin cracks down the middle. The soldier's eyes lock on his jaw, his throat, his shoulders. She has never seen anything like him. None of them have. The patrol captain's name is Dani. 41 years old, served the crown since 15. She watched the waning take her father when she was 3, remembers nothing of him except the sound of coughing that went on for months and then stopped forever. She walks toward Ihyeon with her hand on her sword and her face the color of ash. She asks him what he is, not who, what. Ihyeon drops the firewood, turns, runs. 23 years of training fire through his body like lightning. When seen, you flee. The first rule. The only rule that matters. He makes it 6 steps. The patrol mage hits him with a binding seal that locks his legs to the ground. He crashes face first into the mud, cold earth against his teeth. His mother bursts out of the house screaming. His grandmother throws herself over his body like a shield. She tells the soldiers this is her granddaughter, a birth defect. She tells them anything, everything, and none of it matters because Dayun is already writing the signal scroll. The ink flares gold as it leaves the paper. A message to the capital, to 8 crowns, to the empty throne. A living man has been found. By nightfall, they replace the binding seal with proper restraints. By morning, 2 more patrols arrive. By the 3rd day, 60 soldiers occupy a village of 46. Imperial mages erect a perimeter barrier around Yeomra. No one enters. No one leaves. Ihyeon sits in his own home with his wrists bound and watches through the window as the cage takes shape around him. His mother sits across from him. She hasn't spoken since the 2nd day. Her eyes are red but dry. She knew this moment would come. She prepared for it every day for 23 years, and she's still not ready. He tells her he's sorry. She shakes her head. The crime is being born, she says, and no child should apologize for that. On the 5th day, the escort arrives. 200 elite guards in black and gold. A sealed carriage with no windows. A woman in court robes introduces herself as representative of the Queen of Ice and informs Ihyeon that he is now under imperial protection. He asks what that means. She tells him it means he belongs to the empire. He looks at his bound wrists, asks her what the difference is between protection and imprisonment. She doesn't answer. The carriage takes him south, through mountain passes he's never seen, through forests that stretch beyond the horizon, through cities where thousands of women walk streets that haven't known a male footstep in half a century. He watches through a crack in the carriage wall. A girl on the roadside points at the carriage and asks her mother what's inside. The mother pulls her away without answering. Ihyeon closes his eyes. For 23 years, the cage was a village in the mountains, walls of stone and silence and his mother's fear. Now the cage rolls toward the capital of an empire that sees him as the most valuable object on the continent. He's not a person to them. He's a key, a symbol, a prize to be won by whichever crown moves fastest. He understands this with the clarity of someone who spent his entire life reading the intentions of others while pretending not to exist. Survival taught him that. You watch, you listen, you learn what people want before they say it. And what 8 queens want is him. Not Kang Ih-hyeon, not the quiet man who can identify 37 mountain herbs by smell and mend a roof in the dark. They want what he represents: hope, legitimacy, the future. The carriage hits a stone and lurches. Through the crack, he sees the capital for the first time. Solenthra. White spires and silver bridges stretching across a lake so vast it looks like an inland sea. Banners of 8 colors fly from 8 towers surrounding a central palace that rises above everything else. The imperial seat, empty for 50 years, waiting. He takes a slow breath, tells himself what his grandmother told him every night before sleep. You are not what they need you to be. You are what you choose to be. The carriage passes through the outer gates. The city swallows him whole. The carriage passes through the outer gates. The city swallows him whole. The Hall of 8 Thrones had not been used in 31 years. The last gathering of all 8 queens ended with Rahi driving her sword into the council table and walking out. The scar in the wood was still there. Ihyeon saw it as they led him through the doors, a deep gash in dark oak running from one edge to the middle. No one had repaired it. Maybe they kept it as a reminder. Maybe no one dared touch a mark left by the Queen of Iron. The hall was enormous. Vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of the old empire. Men and women standing together. Kings and queens side by side. The paintings looked like fiction now. 8 thrones arranged in a crescent faced a single raised platform at the center. The imperial seat loomed behind them all, taller and darker and covered in dust. Ihyeon was brought to the platform. He stood there in the same rough-spun clothes he had worn in Yeomra. No one had offered him anything else. The restraints on his wrists had been removed an hour ago, and the skin beneath was still red. He kept his hands at his sides and his breathing even, and he waited. They arrived one by one. The first was Mison, the elder queen. 40 years old, with silver threading through black hair and a face that revealed nothing. She walked to her throne without looking at Ihyeon and sat down with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for the others. The second was Yorin, the Queen of Ice. 29, pale skin and dark eyes that swept the room like a blade. She glanced at Ihyeon for exactly 2 seconds. He felt the assessment in that look. Weight, height, posture, threat level, political value. She cataloged him the way a merchant catalogs inventory, and then she sat down and crossed her legs and became a statue of perfect composure. Rahi came third, the Queen of Iron. 31 years old and built like a weapon given human form. Broad shoulders, scarred hands, a greatsword strapped to her back that was taller than Ihyeon. She did not glance at him. She stared, long and hard and unblinking. He met her gaze because looking away from a predator was worse than looking at one. Something flickered in her expression. Not respect, curiosity maybe. She dropped into her throne with the casual weight of a woman who had never once been afraid of anything in any room. Dani arrived fourth, the Queen Mother, 35. She was the only one who looked at Ihyeon and saw a person. He knew this instantly because her eyes went to his face and not to his body. She paused mid-step. Something crossed her features that was too quick to name and too deep to fake. She pressed her lips together and sat down slowly. Her hands trembled once. She hid them in her sleeves. Imsoa came fifth, the Queen of Shadows, 27. Ihyeon did not see her enter. She was simply there, seated, watching him with an amused tilt of her head, as if she had been in the room all along and no one had noticed. A faint smile lived on her lips. It told him nothing and everything at the same time. Hwayeon arrived sixth, the Queen of Bloom, 33, a healer priestess who moved like water and smelled of white flowers even from across the room. When she stepped through the doors, Ihyeon felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had no source. She felt it too. Her steps faltered for half a heartbeat. Her eyes widened. Then she composed herself and walked to her throne, and the warmth faded to a low hum that Ihyeon could not explain. Gayn stormed in seventh, the Queen of Storms, 25, loud before she spoke a word. The air around her crackled with ambient mana, and her crimson hair whipped behind her like a flag in wind that did not exist. She looked at Ihyeon, and her mouth fell open. She pointed at him. She turned to the nearest queen, which was Yorin, and said something too fast for Ihyeon to catch. Yorin did not respond. Gayn sat down, vibrating with energy that made the armrests of her throne hum. Sebyeol came last, the young queen, 19, a girl wearing a crown too heavy for her head. She walked with careful, practiced steps, and her chin was high, but her fingers gripped the fabric of her robes so tightly that her knuckles were bone white. She was terrified. Ihyeon recognized the effort of performing calm because he had performed it every day of his life. She sat. She placed her hands flat on her knees. She did not look at him. 8 queens, 8 thrones. One man on a platform in peasant clothes with red marks on his wrists. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Ihyeon counted. Mison spoke first. She stated that they all knew why they were here. She said that the man before them was confirmed as biologically male and free of any known illusion or transformation magic. She said he appeared to be immune to the waning. She asked if any queen wished to speak. All 7 wished to speak, at the same time. Rahi declared that the man should be placed under military protection, hers specifically. The Iron Kingdom had the strongest army and the most secure fortresses. Yorin countered that military protection was a polite way of saying captivity, and that the man should be housed in a neutral territory under joint custody. Gayn interrupted to say that she had felt his energy from across the room, and that there was something extraordinary about him, and that everyone should stop talking and let her examine him. Soa noted quietly that 3 separate assassination plots had already been intercepted in the 4 days since news of his discovery spread. Protection was not theoretical. Someone wanted him dead. Dani asked if anyone had considered asking the man what he wanted. The hall went silent for 3 seconds. Then Rahi said his preferences were irrelevant given the scale of what was at stake. Dani looked at her with an expression that could have frozen steel. She said that was exactly the kind of thinking that had kept the imperial throne empty for 50 years. Mison raised one hand. The arguing stopped. She looked at Ihyeon. She asked him to speak. Every eye in the room turned to him. 8 of the most powerful women on the continent, commanders of armies, masters of magic, rulers of millions, all watching a mountain villager in borrowed boots standing on a platform he did not ask to stand on. Ihyeon swallowed. He told them his name was Kang Ih-hyeon. He told them he was from Yeomra. He told them he had spent 23 years hiding because his mother believed the world would kill him if it found him. He said she was right. He looked at each queen in turn. He told them he understood what he represented to them. Hope for the future, a key to legitimacy, a tool for power. He said he would not be any of those things. He said he was a person and he would be treated as one, or they could send him back to his mountain. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Rahi stared at him with something new in her eyes. Yorin uncrossed her legs. Sebyeol looked up for the first time. Gayn whispered something under her breath. Mison studied him for a long moment. Then she said that no one was sending him back, and that the council would deliberate his status. Ihyeon told her that was a polite way of saying they would decide his fate without him. Mison did not blink. She told him he was learning. The doors closed behind him as they led him out. The deliberation began. They gave him a room in the central palace, neutral ground. No single queen could claim jurisdiction over the imperial seat, so it became his cage by default. The room was larger than his entire house in Yeomra. A bed wide enough for 4 people. A window overlooking the Silver Lake. A writing desk with ink and paper he had no use for. Guards stood outside the door. 2 from the Iron Kingdom, 2 from the Ice Kingdom, 2 from the Shadow Kingdom. They rotated every 6 hours in a pattern so complex it required a scheduling document that Ihyeon had already memorized by the 2nd day. He spent the first week watching. The palace was a city within a city. Thousands of servants and officials and soldiers moved through its corridors in patterns dictated by centuries of protocol. Every corridor belonged to a faction. Every dining hall seated a specific rank. Every garden was tended by a specific queen's household. The politics of the place were written in architecture, and Ihyeon read them the way he read animal tracks in mountain snow. Slowly, carefully, missing nothing. On the 3rd day, Hwayeon requested an audience. She came to his room accompanied by 2 temple attendants carrying cases of diagnostic instruments. She explained that she wished to examine the nature of his immunity. She was a healer. Understanding his condition could help millions. Ihyeon agreed because she had asked instead of ordered. She placed her hand over his chest and closed her eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, Ihyeon's skin began to glow. A faint amber light pulsed from beneath his collarbone, spreading outward like roots of fire growing through his veins. Hwayeon pulled her hand back. Her composure cracked for the first time. She told him that what lived inside him was not mere immunity. It was a source, a living flame that burned opposite to the waning. The curse consumed life. His power generated it. They were mirror forces. He asked her what that meant in practical terms. She told him it meant his presence alone weakened the curse. She said that within a certain radius around him, the waning would lose its grip. Boys born near him could survive. Men near him could stop withering. He was not just immune. He was a cure that breathed and walked and had a heartbeat. Ihyeon sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. The amber glow faded slowly. He asked her if that was why the queens wanted him. She hesitated. She told him it was one reason among many, but yes, a man who could end the waning was worth more than any throne. He asked her what she wanted. Hwayeon looked at him. She said she wanted to heal the world. She said she had spent 15 years trying to reverse the waning through temple magic and failed every time. He was the first real hope she had encountered. She asked him if he understood what that felt like, to carry a mission for half your life and finally see a path forward. Ihyeon told her he understood being someone else's path. She flinched. She apologized. He told her there was nothing to apologize for. He said he simply wanted to be clear about the difference between a partner and a resource. She nodded slowly. She asked if he would allow her to continue studying his power with his consent and on his terms. He agreed. She left with her attendants. At the door, she paused. She told him the warmth he felt when she entered the Hall of Eight Thrones was real. Their powers resonated. She did not yet know what that meant. On the 5th day, Gayn did not request an audience. She simply appeared. Ihyeon was standing at his window, watching the lake, when the air behind him cracked with static, and Gayn materialized from a bolt of lightning that scorched a small circle into the palace floor. She landed in a crouch and looked up at him with a grin so wide it threatened to split her face. The guards outside burst through the door with weapons drawn. Gayn waved them away and told them she was a queen and she would go where she pleased. The guards looked at Ihyeon. He told them it was fine. They withdrew with visible reluctance. Gayn circled him like a cat, examining something new. She told him she had been thinking about him for 5 days straight, and she was not accustomed to thinking about anyone for 5 days straight, and she found it deeply irritating. He told her he was sorry for the inconvenience. She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh he had heard since arriving in Solenthra. She told him his energy signature was unlike anything she had encountered. She said he burned like a hearth fire in a world of ice. She said she wanted to understand why. She also said he had good shoulders. He did not know how to respond to that. She sat on his window ledge without permission and asked him what his village was like. He told her about Yeomra, about the bitter vegetables and the narrow sky, and the 37 herbs he could identify by smell. She listened with an intensity that surprised him. When he finished, she told him she ruled a kingdom of storms and salt, and she had never once sat still long enough to learn the name of a single plant. She said she envied him that. He told her envy was a strange response to a life spent hiding. She tilted her head. She said, maybe. But she said hiding meant he had been still long enough to notice things, and most people with power never learn to be still. He had no answer for that. She left through the window, literally. A crack of thunder, and she was gone. The scorch mark on his floor remained. On the 7th day, Imsoa found him. He did not see her arrive either. He was walking the garden path permitted by his guards when a voice spoke from the shadow of a stone lantern. She told him he walked like someone who expected to be followed. He stopped. He looked at the shadow. He could not see her. He told her that was because he was being followed. She laughed. She stepped into the light. The Queen of Shadows was shorter than he expected. Dark hair cut sharp at the jaw. Eyes that cataloged everything with the efficiency of a woman whose profession was knowing. She told him she had read every report written about him, his village, his mother's movements for the past 23 years, the trade routes his grandmother used to sell herbs. She knew what he ate for breakfast in Yeomra. She knew his shoe size. She knew he was left-handed. Ihyeon told her that knowing facts about someone was not the same as knowing them. She smiled. She told him that was the first interesting thing anyone in this palace had said to her in years. She asked him a question. She asked what he thought would happen when the queens stopped being polite. He told her he was not aware they had started. She studied him for a long moment. Then she told him something freely, which he said she rarely did. 3 factions were forming. One wanted to claim him through marriage alliance. One wanted to study him as a weapon against the waning. One wanted him dead because his existence threatened the power structure that 50 years of male absence had built. She told him the 3rd faction was the one he should worry about. He asked her which faction she belonged to. She told him she belonged to whichever faction won. Then she corrected herself. She said she was beginning to reconsider that policy. She disappeared. Not dramatically. He simply blinked and she was gone. The shadow beneath the lantern was empty. Ihyeon stood in the garden alone. 3 factions: marriage, study, murder. And him in the center, with no army and no magic he understood and no allies he could trust. He looked up at the palace towers. 8 banners, 8 colors, 8 women who could crush him with a word or protect him with a gesture. And the difference between the 2 was thinner than silk. He went back to his room. He sat at the writing desk. He picked up a brush and began to draw from memory the patrol rotation schedule of his guards, and the layout of every corridor he had walked, and the location of every exit he had found. Survival had always meant knowing the shape of the cage. This cage was just bigger than the last one. The first Council of Accord was held 9 days after Ihyeon's arrival. The name was Mison's idea. She said calling it a negotiation would imply adversaries, and calling it a summit would imply equals, and calling it a trial would be accurate but impolitic. So she called it the Council of Accord, and everyone understood it was all 3. The 8 queens sat in their thrones. Ihyeon was given a chair this time, a small one placed at the center of the crescent, an improvement from standing on a platform, but not by much. Mison opened by stating the situation plainly. She said the man named Kang Ih-hyeon was confirmed to carry a power that could reverse the waning. She said this power appeared to grow stronger through genuine bonds of trust with those around him. She said 8 kingdoms each had legitimate reason to want him within their borders. She said no kingdom would accept another holding sole custody. She proposed a rotating residency. Ihyeon would spend time in each kingdom in sequence, building understanding with each queen, and allowing his power to benefit all 8 territories. The reaction was immediate. Rahi said rotation was inefficient. She said the man needed 1 protector, not 8, and she was the strongest. Yorin said strength without strategy was just violence with good posture, and that a rotating system required a neutral administrator, which she volunteered to be. Gayn said she did not care about rotation schedules and asked why no one was talking about the fact that his power resonated with theirs and what that meant. Dani repeated her earlier point. She asked if anyone had considered asking Ihyeon. Soa said nothing. She watched. Hwayeon supported the rotation in principle, but noted that Ihyeon's power responded to trust, not proximity. Forcing him into a schedule would accomplish nothing if the connections were not genuine. Sebyeol spoke for the first time in a council. Her voice was quiet but steady. She said that she had read the old histories. She said that before the waning, the emperor did not belong to any single kingdom. The emperor was the bond between all 8. She said perhaps they were approaching this wrong. Perhaps the question was not which queen gets him, but what role he was meant to fill. The hall went quiet. Mison looked at the young queen with an expression Ihyeon could not read. Rahi shifted in her throne. Yorin uncrossed and recrossed her legs. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Imperial consort. The empty throne was not just a symbol. It was a constitutional position, a unifying figure bound to all 8 crowns, someone who belonged to none of them and therefore could belong to all of them. Ihyeon felt the weight of every gaze in the room settle on him like armor he had not asked to wear. He spoke. He said he appreciated the young queen's knowledge of history. He said he also noticed that every proposal so far described what would be done with him rather than what he would choose to do. He said he was willing to visit each kingdom. He said he was willing to learn and to understand and to let whatever power he carried do what it could to heal the world. But he said he would do it on his own terms, not as a consort, not as a prize, not on a schedule written by 8 women who could not agree on the color of the sky. He said he would go where trust was offered, and he would stay where trust was real. Gaon slapped her throne and said she liked him. Rahi told Gaon to be quiet. Yorin watched Ihyeon with an expression that had shifted by a fraction of a degree from calculation to something else. Mison said the council would adopt a provisional arrangement. Ihyeon would remain in the central palace. Each queen could request individual audiences. He would not be compelled to accept any of them. Travel to the 8 kingdoms would be discussed on a case-by-case basis with his agreement. It was the most autonomy they were willing to give, and less than he deserved, and both sides knew it. After the council dissolved, the queens filed out in order of seniority. Mison first, then Dani, then Hwayeon, then Rahi, then Yorin, then Soa, then Gayn. Sebyeol lingered. She stood at the threshold of the great doors and looked back at Ihyeon, who was still sitting in his small chair in the center of 8 empty thrones. She told him she was sorry. He asked for what? She said for all of it. She said she knew what it felt like to be placed on a throne you did not choose. She had been 9 years old when her mother died and the crown was put on her head, and she was told she was a queen now. She said no one asked her either. Then she left. Ihyeon sat alone in the hall. He looked at the scar in the council table, the gash left by Rahi's sword 31 years ago. He looked at the dust on the imperial throne. He looked at the 8 empty seats arranged in a crescent around the spot where he sat. He thought about what Sebyeol had said. He thought about the 9-year-old girl given a crown and told to rule. He thought about the 23-year-old boy given a chair and told to save the world. Neither of them had been asked. That night, he could not sleep. He stood at his window and watched moonlight on the silver lake. The city of Solenthra glittered below. Somewhere in those towers, 8 women were making plans about his future, some with calculation, some with duty, some with something that might become kindness if given enough time. He pressed his palm against the glass. The amber light flickered beneath his skin. Faint, warm, alive. His grandmother had told him once that fire does not choose what it warms. It simply burns and everything nearby receives the heat. He wondered if that was true. He wondered if he had a choice at all, or if he was just a flame being passed between 8 hearths. Choi Dani came to see him on the 12th day. She did not request an audience through official channels. She came to the palace kitchen at dawn when the cooks were still lighting the ovens, and she began to make soup. Ihyeon found her there by accident. He had discovered that the kitchen staff allowed him to walk freely in the early hours, when no one of political importance was awake to object. He entered the kitchen and found a queen in plain robes chopping roots with the practiced hand of someone who had done this before crowns and thrones. She looked up. She told him the palace kitchen had poor knife technique, and she could not watch it any longer. He said he understood. He told her the cooks in Yeomra held their blades the same way, and it bothered his grandmother endlessly. Dani paused. She asked about his grandmother. He told her. He told her about the old woman who could name every medicinal herb on the mountain, who mended his clothes in the dark so no extra candle would draw attention, who sang to him in a voice so low that no one outside the house could hear. Dani listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him about her son. His name was Juwon. He had lived for 11 days. The waning took him on the 12th morning. She had held him through the night and watched the color leave his skin like paint dissolving in water. She said her husband followed 3 months later. The waning was slower with adults. He had time to know what was happening, time to be afraid. Ihyeon did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not be an insult to her grief. He picked up a knife and began chopping beside her. They worked in silence for a long time. When the soup was done, she ladled 2 bowls. They sat on a kitchen bench and ate. She told him the soup was adequate. He told her the seasoning needed salt. She told him he was right and that she respected a man who could critique a queen's cooking. He told her he was critiquing the soup, not the queen. She smiled. It was small and tired and real. She told him something she said she had not told anyone. She said that when she heard a living man had been found, her first thought was not political. Her first thought was that Yeomra could have lived. If this power had existed 11 years ago, her son would be alive. She said she did not want Ihyeon for her kingdom or her throne. She wanted him to exist. Because his existence meant the next mother would not sit through the night holding a boy whose warmth was leaving. Ihyeon put down his spoon. The amber light beneath his skin pulsed once, faint but visible in the dim kitchen. Dani stared at it. He told her he could not bring back what she had lost. She told him she knew. She said she was not asking for that. She was asking him to let the world be different going forward. He told her that was the first request from a queen that sounded like it was meant for a person and not a symbol. She finished her soup. She stood. She told him he was welcome in her kingdom whenever he wished, not as a consort, not as a political asset, as a guest. She left through the kitchen door. The cooks arrived an hour later and found 2 empty bowls on the bench and a pot of soup on the stove, and asked each other who had been cooking before dawn. That afternoon, Ihyeon received a different kind of visitor. A messenger arrived in court robes, bearing seals from 3 kingdoms he did not recognize. The messenger presented a formal document. It was a petition signed by 47 noble houses from across the empire, demanding that Ihyeon be placed under the authority of the Temple Congress, not the queen's. The argument was theological. The waning was a divine punishment. A man who survived divine punishment was either blessed or cursed. Either way, he belonged to the temples, not the thrones. The messenger waited for a response. Ikhyeon read the document. He asked the messenger who had actually written it. The messenger said it was a collective petition. Ihyeon said he understood that was the official answer. He asked for the real one. The messenger hesitated. Then he said nothing and bowed and left. Ihyeon brought the petition to the only queen he thought would tell him the truth about it. He went to the shadow garden where he had last encountered Soa. He stood by the stone lantern and waited. 4 minutes passed. Soa spoke from behind him. She told him he was getting better at finding her. He told her he was not finding her. He was standing still and letting her find him. She stepped into the light and took the petition. She read it in under a minute. She told him the document was a front. The 47 noble houses were real, but the coordination was not organic. Someone had organized them. She said the language of the petition was designed to do one thing: remove him from the queen's collective protection and place him in a system where he could be more easily isolated. She asked him if he remembered her warning about the third faction, the one that wanted him dead. He said he remembered. She told him this was their first public move, not assassination, something subtler. Strip his protectors, isolate him legally, redefine him as a theological subject rather than a political one. Temples could hold him indefinitely for study. Study could become containment. Containment could become disappearance. He asked her who was behind it. She told him she did not know yet. She said that was unusual for her, and she did not enjoy the feeling. She told him to be careful at the next council meeting. She said someone in the room would support the petition, and that person would reveal the shape of the third faction. He asked her why she was helping him. She looked at him. She told him she collected information. She said information without context was just noise. He was context. He made things that had been invisible for years suddenly visible, and she found that useful. She added that he was also not boring. She said most powerful people were dreadfully predictable, and he was not. He told her that was because he had no power. She corrected him. She said he had the only power that mattered. He made people show who they really were. She vanished into the garden shadows. Ihyeon stood alone with the petition in his hand. The paper was heavy, official. The seals were real. Somewhere in the empire, someone was building a cage more sophisticated than restraints or carriages. A cage made of law and theology and procedure. He folded the petition and placed it inside his coat. He walked back to his room. He passed the 2 Iron Kingdom guards and the 2 Ice Kingdom guards and the 2 Shadow Kingdom guards. 6 women whose job was to protect him and watch him and report on him in equal measure. He entered his room. He sat at his writing desk. He added the petition to his growing map of the palace. Names, factions, alliances, debts. He was building the shape of the cage. And somewhere in that shape, he would find the seam, the weak point, the crack through which a man who had spent his whole life hiding could slip free. Not to escape. Escape was no longer possible. Free to choose. That was all he had ever wanted. The Second Council of Accord was called 3 days after the petition arrived. Mison convened it with unusual speed, which told Ihyeon that even the elder queen had not expected this move. The 8 thrones were occupied. Ihyeon sat in his chair at the center. The petition lay on the council table next to the scar from Rahi's sword. Mison presented the matter plainly. She said 47 noble houses had formally requested that the man known as Kang Ih-hyeon be transferred to the authority of the Temple Congress for theological examination and custodial study. She said the petition had legal standing under imperial charter. She asked if any queen wished to speak. Hwayeon spoke first. As the Queen of Bloom and the ruler of the Temple Kingdom, she said the petition was an insult to her authority. The Temple Congress operated under her crown. Any theological matter involving a living anomaly fell under her jurisdiction, and no coalition of noble houses could bypass that. She said the petition was not theology. It was politics wearing a priest's robe. Rahi agreed. She said that removing Ihyeon from collective royal protection was a tactical move to isolate a strategic asset. She said whoever was behind the petition understood military doctrine, even if they dressed it in scripture. Yorin said nothing for a long time. She sat with her fingers steepled and her dark eyes moving from face to face around the crescent. When she finally spoke, she said the petition should be accepted in principle. The room went cold. Rahi turned to her with an expression that promised violence. Gayn stood from her throne, and lightning crackled along her fingertips. Even Mison shifted in her seat. Yorin raised one hand. She continued. She said accepting the petition in principle did not mean surrendering Ihyeon. It meant acknowledging the legal framework and then using that framework to control the process. If they rejected the petition outright, the 47 houses would claim the queens were hoarding a divine subject for political gain. Public opinion would shift. The temples across the continent would rally. A rejection would unite their enemies. An acceptance on their terms would divide them. She proposed a compromise, a joint theological and royal commission. Half temple scholars appointed by Hwayeon, half royal advisors appointed by the council. The commission would examine Ihyeon's nature and report to both the queens and the Temple Congress simultaneously. No transfer of custody, no isolation. The petition would be answered without giving ground. Soa watched Yorin with visible appreciation. Ihyeon watched Soa watch Yorin and understood something. The Queen of Ice had just performed surgery on a political trap, and the Queen of Shadows was the only other person in the room who fully appreciated the precision. Mison called a vote. The compromise passed 7-1. Kalin voted against because she said commissions were a waste of time, and someone should just find whoever wrote the petition and strike them with lightning. Her objection was noted and ignored. After the vote, Mison asked if any queen had additional business. Sebyeol raised her hand. She stood. She said she had spent the past week researching the imperial archives. She said the role of imperial consort was not merely ceremonial. Under the original charter of the Solenn Empire, the consort was a constitutional counterweight to the 8 crowns. The consort held no army and no territory, but held something else, the right of refusal. The consort could refuse any decree that did not carry the agreement of at least 5 of 8 queens. The consort was designed to prevent tyranny by majority. She said the position had been empty for 50 years because there had been no one to fill it. She looked at Ihyeon. She did not say the obvious. She did not need to. The silence said it for her. Rahi broke it. She said the girl was clever, but cleverness without power was just commentary. Sebyeol held Rahi's gaze. She said power without structure was just chaos, and that the empire had been running on chaos for 50 years. Rahi blinked. Ihyeon saw something change behind the warrior's eyes. Not anger, something closer to reevaluation. Mison said the matter of the consort position would be tabled for future discussion. The council adjourned. As the queens filed out, Yorin passed Ihyeon's chair. She paused for one step. She told him quietly that she had expected him to object during the commission vote. He told her he had nothing to object to. She had solved the problem before it became one. She looked at him. She said most people did not notice when she solved problems. They only noticed when problems existed. He told her that was because most people watched what was happening. He watched what did not happen. Something shifted in her expression. It was small, a fracture in the ice so thin it was almost invisible. She walked on without another word. That night, Ihyeon could not sleep again. He walked the corridors permitted by his guards until he reached the east terrace overlooking the lake. He did not expect to find anyone there. Sebyeol sat on the stone railing with her legs dangling over the edge. Her crown was off. Without it, she looked like what she was. A 19-year-old girl, exhausted by the weight of ruling a kingdom she had inherited as a child. She heard his footsteps and turned. She did not seem surprised. She told him she came here most nights. She said the palace was quieter after midnight, and the lake reflected the stars, and for a few hours, she could pretend she was not a queen. He sat on the railing beside her, not close enough to talk without raising his voice. She asked him if he was frightened. He told her he was. She said she was glad. She said everyone in the palace pretended they were not afraid, and it was exhausting to be the only honest person in every room. He told her she was not the only one, not anymore. She pulled her knees to her chest. She told him about her mother, Queen Moon Hye-in, a brilliant ruler who had held her kingdom together through 3 border disputes and a famine. She died of a blood fever when Sebyeol was 9. The crown was placed on her head the same day. She remembers the metal was still warm from her mother's body. Ihyeon listened. He said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She told him she had read every book in the imperial archive about the consort position. She said she brought it up at council not because she wanted to claim him. She wanted to give him a legal identity that was not prisoner or prize or weapon. She said a consort had rights. A man standing in the center of 8 thrones had none. He looked at her. He told her that was the second time a queen had done something for him without wanting something in return. She asked who was first. He said Dani. Sebyeol smiled. She said Dani was the best of them, and that anyone who disagreed was wrong. They sat in silence for a while. The lake reflected the stars. Somewhere below the terrace, a night bird called across the water and received no answer. Sebyeol told him one more thing. She said the petition was not the real threat. She said during the council vote, she had watched every queen's face and hands and posture. She said 7 queens were genuinely opposed to the petition. She said one queen voted correctly, but her hands were wrong. He asked what she meant. She said the queen voted to support Yorin's compromise, but her fingers had tightened on the armrest when the vote was called. Relief or tension. It was impossible to tell from across the room. He asked which queen. Sebyeol told him, Hwayeon. He said nothing. The amber light beneath his skin flickered once and went dark. Ihyeon did not confront Hwayeon. Confrontation was a tool for people with power. He had none. What he had was patience and the ability to watch without being noticed, which was a skill 23 years of hiding had carved into his bones. He began spending more time in the temple wing of the palace. Hwayeon had established a small sanctum there for her ongoing study of his power. He visited willingly. He let her place her hands on his chest and channel diagnostic prayers through his body. He answered her questions about his childhood and his health, and the first time he noticed the warmth beneath his skin. And while she worked, he watched her. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. Her questions were precise and professional. But twice during their 3rd session, her eyes moved to the door when footsteps passed in the corridor. Once she paused mid-sentence and tilted her head as if listening for something specific. Ihyeon cataloged these moments the way he cataloged herbs, by scent and texture, and the subtle differences that separated medicine from poison. On the 15th day, he changed his approach. Instead of waiting for Hwayeon to ask questions, he asked one of his own. He asked her about the origin of the waning. She told him what the temples taught. A catastrophic magical event 50 years ago, source unknown, effect irreversible by any known method. The temples had studied it for decades and concluded it was either divine punishment or a natural magical disaster, depending on which doctrinal school you followed. He asked her which school she followed. She hesitated for one heartbeat longer than natural. She said she followed the evidence. He asked what the evidence suggested. She said the evidence suggested the waning was not natural. Something in her voice when she said it told him she knew more than she was sharing. He did not push. Pushing would close the door. He simply noted the hesitation and moved on. That same afternoon, Rahi found him in the training courtyard. He had taken to walking there because the open space reminded him of the mountain clearings near Yeomra. Rahi was drilling with her greatsword. The blade moved in arcs that should have been impossible for a weapon that size. Each swing displaced enough air to ripple his clothes from 10 paces away. She finished her form and drove the sword point first into the stone courtyard. It sank 3 inches into solid granite. She looked at him. She told him he walked too quietly. She said she was trained to detect assassins at 40 paces, and she had not heard him until 20. He told her his mother had taught him to walk without sound. Rahi pulled her sword from the stone. She examined the tip for damage. There was none. She asked him why his mother had taught him that. He told her. He told her about the patrols that sometimes passed near Yeomra, about the hunters who wandered the mountain trails, about the time when he was 7 and a tax collector came within 100 paces of their house, and his mother held her hand over his mouth for 4 hours until the woman left. Rahi listened. She did not sit. She stood with her sword planted and her arms crossed over the pommel, and her scarred hands wrapped around steel. When he finished, she told him something in return. She said she had been fighting since she was 12. Her mother was Queen of Ihyeon before her and died in a border skirmish when Rahi was 20. She had been at war in one form or another for 19 years. She said war was simple. You were strong or you were dead. Everything in between was just waiting. She said the court made her sick. The politics, the maneuvering, the polite words that meant nothing. She said a sword told the truth. It cut or it did not. She looked at him. She said he confused her. He had no sword, no magic he could control. No army, no title, no authority. And yet he stood in the center of 8 queens and did not bend. She asked him how. He told her bending was a choice, not a necessity. She said for most people, it was both. He told her he was not most people. She stared at him for a long time. Then she did something unexpected. She drew a short blade from her belt, a dagger with a leather-wrapped handle and a blade the length of his forearm. She held it out to him. She told him the court was no place for an unarmed man. He looked at the blade. He told her he had never held a weapon. She said that was obvious from the way he stood. She said she would teach him. Not to fight like a soldier. He did not have the build or the years for that. She would teach him to defend himself long enough for help to arrive. He took the dagger. It was heavier than he expected. The leather was worn smooth by years of use. He asked her whose it had been. She told him it was her mother's. He looked up at her. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that neither named. He said he would learn. She nodded. She told him dawn in the courtyard every 3rd day. She said if he was late, she would assume he was dead and act accordingly. She walked away. The great sword on her back caught the afternoon sun and blazed like a signal fire. Ihyeon held the dagger. He turned it in his hands. The weight of it settled into his palm like an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. Not power, not violence. Trust. The Queen of Iron had given him her mother's blade. In the language of warriors, that meant something words could not carry. That evening, he sought out Soa. He found her in the shadow garden. He told her what Sebyeol had observed about Hwayeon during the council vote. Soa did not seem surprised. She told him she had noticed the same thing, but wanted to see if anyone else caught it. She said Hwayeon was not necessarily an enemy. She said the Queen of Bloom had spent 15 years studying the waning, and 15 years was long enough to learn things the temples did not want known. If Hwayeon was hiding something, it might be because the truth was dangerous enough to require hiding. She told him there was a difference between deception and discretion. He asked her how to tell which one Hwayeon was practicing. She told him to give the healer a reason to choose honesty. He asked how. She said he already knew. His power grew from trust. Trust was the only currency he had, and it was the one currency that could not be counterfeited. Ihyeon left the garden. He walked back to his room. He sat at his desk and looked at the dagger Rahi had given him. He looked at the petition he had filed away. He looked at the map of the palace he was building piece by piece. Somewhere in this web of queens and factions and secrets, a truth was hiding. The waning was not natural. Hwayeon knew something. The 3rd faction wanted him dead, and his power was not an accident. He pressed his palm flat on the desk. The amber light glowed steady and warm. He was not a warrior. He was not a king. He was a man with a fire that answered to trust, and a mind that had been trained since birth to see what others missed. That would have to be enough. On the 18th day, the first boy was born in Solenthra in 47 years. A servant woman in the outer palace gave birth at dawn, and the midwife who delivered the child dropped to her knees and did not stand for 10 minutes. The news reached the Hall of 8 Thrones before noon. By evening, every person in the capital knew. A boy. Breathing. Alive. Healthy. Pink and screaming, and utterly ordinary in every way except that he existed. The mother had been working within the palace grounds for 3 weeks, within the radius of Ihyeon's presence. The waning had not touched her child. The effect was undeniable. Hwayeon's earlier assessment was confirmed in flesh and blood, and the wailing of an infant boy who did not know he was the first of his kind in half a century. Ihyeon heard the news from his guards. The Iron Kingdom soldier who told him had tears on her face. She was not a woman who cried easily. Her armor was scarred from a dozen campaigns. But she stood at his door with water running down her cheeks and told him that a boy had been born alive and the city was singing. He went to the window. Below, in the streets of Solenthra, people were pouring out of their homes. The sound reached him even through the glass. Not cheering exactly. Something rawer than that. A sound that came from a place deeper than celebration. 50 years of grief cracking open all at once. He pressed his forehead against the glass. The amber light pulsed through his veins in rhythm with his heartbeat. He thought about Danis' son Jiwan, who had lived 11 days. He thought about the thousands of boys who had never drawn a second breath. He thought about his own mother, holding her hand over his mouth in the dark. This child would not need to hide. That was worth something. That was worth everything. The political consequences arrived within hours. Messengers flooded the palace from every kingdom. 3 more pregnancies in the capital were confirmed as male. Scouts reported that the waning had measurably weakened within a 2-league radius of the palace. Outside that radius, the curse held firm. The implication was clear. Ihyeon was not a symbolic hope. He was a functional cure. But the cure had a range, and the range was centered on him. Every kingdom wanted that radius within their borders. The fragile cooperation of the Council of Accord buckled under the weight of what a living, breathing boy meant to 8 queens who had watched their world die for 50 years. Rahi sent a formal request for Ihyeon to visit the Iron Kingdom immediately. Her territory bordered 3 hostile regions, and her soldiers were dying of attrition faster than she could replace them. Male births in her kingdom would secure military survival for the next generation. Yorin submitted a counterproposal. She argued that the economic heart of the empire should be prioritized. Her kingdom generated 40% of imperial trade revenue. Economic collapse would destroy all 8 kingdoms, not just hers. Gayn did not submit a proposal. She came to Ihyeon's room and told him directly that her kingdom was suffering and her people were afraid, and she needed him. Not wanted, needed. Her voice broke on the word. He had never heard her voice break before. She did not cry. She stood in his doorway with lightning flickering in her hair, and her jaw set, and her eyes bright with something she refused to let fall. He told her he heard her. She nodded once and left, without the theatrics that usually accompanied her exits. No thunder, no lightning. Just a woman walking away, carrying the weight of a kingdom she could not save alone. Dani did not send a request. She came to the kitchen at dawn again. They made soup together. She did not mention the boy. She did not mention politics or kingdoms or the waning. She asked him if he slept well. He told her he did not. She nodded. She said she did not sleep well either. She said she had not slept well in 11 years. They ate in silence. Before she left, she told him the boy had been named Suho. It meant protector. She said the mother had asked what Ihyeon's name meant, and when she learned it, she chose Suho because she wanted her son to protect others the way Ihyeon had protected him simply by existing. Ihyeon put down his spoon. The amber light in his veins flared once, and Dani saw it. She placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and steady. She held his hand for a moment and then released it, and walked away, and the kitchen was empty except for 2 bowls and a pot of cooling soup and the fading glow beneath his skin. The 3rd council was called the following morning. The atmosphere was different from the first 2. The queens did not argue about custody or theology or legal frameworks. They argued about survival. Rahi slammed her fist on the table and said her soldiers were dying. Yorin spoke in the measured tones of someone holding back an avalanche and said the economy was failing. Kalin said nothing, which was more frightening than anything she could have said. Hwayeon presented data. She said the radius of Ihyeon's effect was approximately 2 leagues. She said it appeared to strengthen when he formed genuine emotional connections with those around him. She said theoretically the radius could expand. She did not say how. Everyone in the room understood how. Mison cut through the noise. She said the situation had changed. The petition from the noble houses was now irrelevant. No one was going to argue about theology when boys were being born alive. The real question was practical. 1 man, 8 kingdoms, 2 league radius. Mathematics that did not resolve peacefully. She said Ihyeon needed to travel. She said the rotation that Yorin had originally proposed was no longer a diplomatic framework. It was a medical necessity. She looked at Ihyeon. She asked him if he understood what was being asked. He told her he understood. 8 kingdoms needed him physically present for their populations to survive. Staying in the capital saved only the capital. He said he was willing to travel, but he repeated what he had said before. He would go where trust was offered. He said he would not be loaded into a sealed carriage and shipped between kingdoms like cargo on a trade route. He would walk into each kingdom freely, or he would not walk at all. Rahi said that was impractical. The roads were dangerous, and he was not a fighter. He looked at her. He told her she was teaching him to use a dagger. She could teach him on the road. Something shifted in Rahi's face. The corner of her mouth moved by a fraction. It was the closest thing to a smile he had ever seen from her. Mison declared the rotation would begin in 1 week. The order would be determined by proximity and need. The first kingdom would be the closest. That was the Storm Kingdom, Gayn's territory. Ikhyeon looked up. For the first time since the meeting began, her eyes had light in them. She did not speak. She simply looked at Ihyeon across the room, and the gratitude in her expression was so raw that it needed no words. The journey to the Storm Kingdom took 4 days on horseback. Ihyeon had never ridden a horse. Rahi spent the first morning teaching him how not to fall off, and the second morning teaching him how not to look like he was about to fall off. By the 3rd day, he could hold a steady trot without gripping the saddle with both hands, and Rahi told him he was adequate, which, from her, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The escort was carefully composed. 2 guards from each kingdom, 16 soldiers in total. A deliberate balance so that no single crown controlled access to him on the road. Hwayeon rode with them as the official medical advisor to monitor the expansion and contraction of Ihyeon's radius as they traveled. Gayn rode ahead, scouting the weather, which was the official explanation for why she kept galloping back to ride beside Ihyeon and point out landmarks and interesting cloud formations, and a particularly large hawk that she claimed was an omen of good fortune. The road south from Solenn cut through rolling grasslands that turned to coastal hills within 2 days. The Storm Kingdom occupied the southern peninsula of the empire, a land of cliffs and ocean winds and electrical storms that rolled in from the sea with a regularity that the locals tracked by smell alone. Gayn told Ihyeon that her people could feel lightning in their teeth before it struck. He told her that was either impressive or concerning. She told him it was both. On the second night, they camped on a hilltop overlooking the sea. The guards established a perimeter. Hwayeon set up a medical tent for her instruments. Rahi posted herself at the highest point and stood watch with her greatsword planted like a flagpole. Ihyeon sat by the fire and watched the stars. Kang sat beside him. For once, she was quiet. The constant motion that defined her had settled into something still. The firelight painted her crimson hair in shades of copper and gold. She told him she was afraid of the ocean. He looked at her. The Queen of Storms was afraid of the sea? She explained. She said storms were power she understood. Wind obeyed her. Lightning answered her call. Rain fell where she directed it. But the ocean was beyond even her. It was vast and indifferent, and it took what it wanted, and no amount of magic could hold it back. She said her mother had drowned, a storm that even the Queen of Storms could not control. Gayn had been 14. She inherited the crown and the storms and the coastline that had killed her mother. and she had spent 11 years pretending she was not terrified every time the tide came in. Ihyeon asked her why she was telling him this. She said she did not know. She said she had not told anyone before. She said there was something about him that made secrets feel lighter, like the weight of holding them was not worth the effort when he was nearby. The amber light in his chest pulsed faintly. He felt the warmth spread through him. Not toward Gayn specifically, through him and outward, like heat from a stone that had been sitting in the sun. Hwayeon emerged from the medical tent. She told them the radius had expanded by 1/4 league since morning. She said it was the largest single-day increase she had recorded. She looked at Gayn, and then at Ihyeon, and then back at Gayn, and something complicated moved behind her eyes. She returned to her tent without further comment. They reached the Storm Kingdom capital on the 4th day, Stormhaven, a city carved into cliff faces overlooking a harbor so wide the far shore was invisible. The buildings were made of dark stone, reinforced with wind wards and lightning rods, and every surface was carved with flowing patterns that Gayon said represented the breath of the sky. The people lined the streets. They did not cheer, they stared. Thousands of women and a handful of elderly men who had somehow survived the waning into their 70s stared at the young man riding through their city on a borrowed horse. Some of them reached out as if touching the air near him would change something. Some of them wept. A girl who could not have been older than 6 ran alongside his horse and asked her mother if that was what a man looked like. The mother picked her up and held her and did not answer. Ihyeon gripped the reins until his knuckles went white. He was not a symbol. He was not a cure. He was a man on a horse surrounded by grief that had been building for 50 years, and he could feel every second of it pressing against his chest. That night, the storms came. Not natural storms. Gayn called them to celebrate his arrival. Lightning danced across the sky in patterns so precise they looked choreographed. Thunder rolled in rhythms that the locals clapped along to. Rain fell in curtains that somehow avoided the festival grounds where tables had been set with food and drink and flowers. Ihyeon stood on a balcony above the celebration and watched. Gayn appeared beside him. She had changed from her riding clothes into storm-dark robes that crackled with ambient charge. Her hair floated around her head like a crown of fire. She asked him if he was enjoying the welcome. He told her her people were staring at him like he was a ghost walking. She said that was because, to them, he was. An entire generation had grown up without ever seeing a man his age. He was not just rare, he was mythological. He told her that was a terrible amount of pressure for someone who could not ride a horse 5 days ago. She laughed. The storm above them responded. Lightning forked across the sky in a shape that almost looked like a smile. She told him she wanted to show him something. She took his hand. Her skin was hot. Not warm, hot, like holding a live coal wrapped in silk. She pulled him to the edge of the balcony and pointed out across the sea. On the horizon, a wall of clouds was building. Dark and massive and rolling toward the coast with the inevitability of a slow avalanche. She told him that storm would hit in 6 hours. She said it was the largest formation of the season. Normally, she would disperse it or redirect it, but she wanted to let it come. She wanted to show him what her kingdom lived with every day. She said he should understand what she protected her people from before he decided how much of himself he was willing to give. He looked at the approaching storm. He looked at Gayn standing beside him with lightning in her hair and fear of the ocean in her bones, and the weight of a kingdom balanced on shoulders that still flinched when the waves hit the cliffs. He told her he was not going anywhere. She squeezed his hand. The amber light in his chest answered the lightning in hers. For one moment, the air between them hummed with a resonance that neither of them fully understood. Then she let go and walked back to the celebration, and the moment passed. But something had changed. The radius pulsed outward. Hwayeon recorded it from her monitoring station and wrote a single note in her journal. Connection confirmed. Resonance increasing. The fire grows when it is not alone. The storm hit Stormhaven at the 3rd hour past midnight. Ihyeon woke to the sound of the sea trying to climb the cliffs. The wind screamed through the carved stone corridors of the palace, and the lightning rods on every tower sang with charge. He went to the window. The harbor below was chaos. Waves as tall as buildings crashed against the breakwater. Ships strained at their moorings. The sky was a solid wall of black cloud, split by veins of white fire. Gayn was already on the outer wall. He could see her silhouette against the lightning. Her arms were raised, and the storm bent around her like a river dividing at a stone. She was not stopping it. She was steering it, channeling the worst of the wind away from the harbor and the residential cliffs, redirecting lightning strikes to the rods, splitting wave surges with walls of compressed air. She had been doing this alone for 11 years, every storm, every season. One woman holding back the sea with nothing but will and magic, and the knowledge that if she failed, people would die. Ihyeon dressed and went outside. The guards tried to stop him. He told them he was going and they could follow or stay. They followed. The rain hit him like a wall. Within seconds, he was soaked through. The wind tore at his clothes and nearly knocked him off his feet. He grabbed a railing and pulled himself along the corridor toward the outer wall. Rahi appeared from nowhere. She had her sword drawn against the wind, as if she could cut it. She shouted at him over the storm. She asked him what he was doing. He told her he was going to Gayn. Rahi stared at him through sheets of rain. Then she sheathed her sword and grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. She carved a path through the storm with her body and her will, and they reached the outer wall together. Gayn did not notice them at first. Her eyes were white with channeled power. Every muscle in her body was locked rigid against forces that would have torn a normal person apart. The veins in her arms glowed blue with storm mana, and her feet had cracked the stone where she stood from the sheer pressure of the energy flowing through her. She was magnificent, and she was breaking. Ihyeon could see it, the tremor in her fingers, the sweat mixing with rain on her face, the way her breath came in ragged gasps between each channeled strike. She had been at this for over an hour. Her reserves were failing. He stepped forward. Rahi reached for him, but stopped. Something in his expression told her to let him go. He walked to Gayn. The wind should have thrown him off the wall. It did not. The amber light in his chest ignited. Not the faint pulse he was accustomed to, a full blaze. Golden fire erupted from his skin and spread outward in a sphere of warmth that pushed the rain back and turned the wind from a scream to a whisper within 3 paces of his body. Gayn felt it. Her white eyes flickered. She turned her head and saw him standing beside her, wreathed in golden light that had no business existing in the middle of a hurricane. The resonance ignited between them. His fire and her lightning met, and the reaction was immediate. The golden light raced up her arms and merged with the blue storm mana. The trembling stopped. Her reserves refilled. Not slowly, all at once, like a river dammed for years suddenly released. She gasped. Her hands steadied. The storm obeyed her with a precision that had not been there before. She did not just redirect it now. She commanded it. The worst of the waves split and passed harmlessly around the harbor. The wind died to a manageable gale. The lightning stopped striking randomly and danced in controlled arcs between the rods. Gayn lowered her arms. The storm was not over, but it was tamed. She turned to Ihyeon. Rain ran down her face. Her crimson hair was plastered to her skin. The blue glow in her veins was fading, but where it had touched his golden light, something new remained. A warmth in the air between them that the rain could not cool. She told him he was an idiot for coming out in a storm. He told her she was an idiot for facing it alone for 11 years. She laughed. It was raw and exhausted and genuine. She said no one had ever called the queen an idiot to her face before. He said he was not talking to a queen. He was talking to a woman standing in the rain. The golden light faded. The storm ebbed over the next hour. By dawn, the sky was clear, and the harbor was intact, and Stormhaven had survived another season. The cost was visible in the debris scattered across the lower districts, and the seawater pooling in basement corridors, and the exhausted faces of the storm wardens who had been working through the night alongside their queen. But no one had died. Not one person. Gayoon told him that had never happened before. In every major storm, she lost someone. A fisherman caught on the water, a cliff dweller whose home gave way, a warden who pushed too hard and burned out. This time, the death count was 0, because his fire had given her enough power to cover every gap. Hwayeon documented everything. She measured the radius. It had doubled overnight. 2 leagues had become 4. The waning was not just weakening within range of Ihyeon. It was retreating, as if the curse recognized an opposing force and chose to withdraw rather than fight. She wrote her findings in her journal. She did not share them with the council immediately. Ihyeon noticed this. He did not confront her. He remembered Soa's advice. Give her a reason to choose honesty. He was still searching for that reason. The morning after the storm, Rahi came to him for training. He expected her to be angry about the previous night, about the risk he took walking into a hurricane with no armor and no magic he could control. She was not angry. She handed him the dagger and told him to take his stance. They drilled for an hour. Block, redirect, step. She did not mention the storm once. When they finished, she told him his footwork was improving. Then she said one more thing. She said that what he did on the wall was the bravest thing she had seen from someone without a weapon. She said bravery without a sword was rarer than bravery with one. He told her it was not bravery. He said he simply could not watch someone fight alone when he had the ability to help. She looked at him. She said that was the definition of bravery. She walked away. Her greatsword caught the morning sun. On the balcony above the training courtyard, Yorin stood watching. She had arrived in Stormhaven that morning on a fast ship from the capital. Official reason was economic assessment of storm damage. Actual reason was the report Hwayeon had sent about the radius doubling. Yorin watched Ihyeon train with Rahi. She watched the easy rhythm that had developed between them. Teacher and student. Warrior and the man who had walked into a storm because a queen was alone. She watched and she calculated, and for the first time in her career as a strategist, she found that her calculations kept producing an answer she did not want to examine. The man was not a variable on a board. He was something her equations had no term for. Yorin requested a private audience on the morning after her arrival in Stormhaven. She did not come to his room. She sent a note with coordinates. A lighthouse on the northern cliff abandoned after a storm had cracked its foundation 10 years ago. Ihyeon found her standing at the top with her hands behind her back and the wind pulling at her dark hair. The sea spread below them, gray and endless. She did not turn when he reached the top of the stairs. She told him she had spent 4 days on a ship reviewing every report written about him since his discovery. She said she had read transcripts of his conversations with Dani and Gayn and Rahi. She said Soa's intelligence network had filed observations about his behavioral patterns and sleep schedule and dietary preferences. She said she probably knew more about him than he knew about himself. He told her that knowing about someone was not the same as knowing them. She turned. Her dark eyes were unreadable. She said Soa had told her he would say exactly that. She said it was irritating when people were predictable about being unpredictable. He told her she had not come to a broken lighthouse to discuss his predictability. She conceded the point. She told him the radius expansion was a problem, not the expansion itself, the politics of it. His power had doubled overnight through a genuine bond with one queen. If that pattern held, then every queen who formed a real connection with him would amplify his reach. 8 bonds, 8 amplifications. The potential radius could cover the entire continent. The waning could end entirely. But only if all 8 connections were real. She said the mathematics of salvation had a variable that no strategist could control: sincerity. She said she found this deeply inconvenient. He asked her why she was telling him this. She said because she needed him to understand her position. She said she was the queen of ice. Her kingdom ran on calculation and trade and the precise management of resources. She had built her power on the ability to predict outcomes and control variables. He was a variable she could not control, and she needed to decide how to respond to that. He asked her what the options were. She listed them. Option 1. Treat him as a political asset and maintain professional distance. Efficient, but it would not generate the resonance needed to expand his radius into her territory. Option 2. Manufacture a false emotional connection. Her intelligence suggested this would fail because his power responded only to genuine trust. Option 3. She stopped. He waited. She said option 3 was the one she was having difficulty with. He told her to say it. She told him option 3 was to stop calculating and allow herself to respond to him as a person rather than a variable. She said she had not done that with anyone in 15 years. She said the last person she trusted without calculation was her father, and he died of the waning when she was 14. And she decided then that trust without strategy was a luxury she could not afford. The wind picked up. Her hair whipped across her face. She did not brush it away. He asked her what she was afraid of. She said she was not afraid. He said nothing. She met his eyes. The silence stretched. Then she said she was afraid of needing someone she could not replace. She said her entire system was built on the principle that every person and resource had a substitute. If one trade route failed, another opened. If one ally betrayed her, another could be purchased. But there was no substitute for him. There was one man immune to the waning on the entire continent. If she needed him, she could not replace him. And that terrified her more than any army. Ihyeon stepped closer to her. Not close enough to touch. Close enough that the amber light in his chest would be visible in the gray morning light. He told her he was not asking her to need him. He said need was a cage the same as any other. He said he was asking her to consider that trust and strategy were not opposites. She could be brilliant and careful and calculated and still allow one door to remain unguarded. She looked at the amber glow pulsing beneath his collar. She said he was asking her to be vulnerable. He said he was asking her to be human. She stared at him for a long time. Then she told him that was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to her. Because it was true. She walked past him toward the stairs. At the top step, she paused. She told him her father used to take her to lighthouses when she was a child. He said they were the loneliest buildings in the world because they existed to help everyone else find their way home, but they themselves were always standing alone in the dark. She said she had not been to a lighthouse since he died. He asked her why she chose this one. She did not answer. She descended the stairs and was gone. Ihyeon stood at the top of the abandoned lighthouse and looked out at the sea. The amber light pulsed once. Faint, warm, patient. Yorin had not given him trust. She had given him something rarer. She had shown him the exact shape of the wall she had built around herself. And that was the first crack. That evening, Soa appeared in his quarters without warning. She told him she had intercepted a message. Not political, personal. A letter from the Temple Congress addressed to Hwayeon, marked with a seal he did not recognize. Soa said the seal belonged to an order within the temples that had been officially dissolved 30 years ago. The Order of the First Light. She said the order had been founded by the first empress of the Solenn Empire, and its purpose had been erased from public record. She told him Hwayeon had received 3 such letters since his arrival in the capital. She did not know the contents. Hwayeon's personal encryption was beyond even her network. He asked her what she thought it meant. She said it meant Hwayeon was connected to something old, something that predated the waning by centuries and survived it by design. She said whatever Hwayeon was hiding was not a small secret. It was the kind of secret that had roots deep enough to touch the foundations of the empire itself. He asked her what she wanted to do about it. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen before. It was not amusement or calculation or professional detachment. It was concern. She told him she wanted to protect him. She said she had spent her career protecting information, data, secrets. She said this was the first time she wanted to protect a person. She said she did not entirely enjoy the feeling, but she was not going to ignore it. He thanked her. She told him not to thank her. She told him to survive. That was more useful than gratitude. They returned to the capital after 12 days in the Storm Kingdom. The results were undeniable. Within Ihyeon's expanded radius, 17 boys had been born alive. 4 men in advanced stages of the waning had stabilized. The oldest was 73, and he wept when the bleeding in his lungs stopped for the first time in a decade. Gayn stood at the harbor when they departed. She did not say goodbye. She told him she would see him soon. The way she said it was not a question. It was a declaration made to the universe itself, and the universe did not appear inclined to argue. The return journey was quieter than the departure. Rahi rode beside him and continued his dagger training during rest stops. His footwork was better. His grip was steady. He would never be a warrior, but he could defend a doorway for 60 seconds. And Rahi said 60 seconds was the difference between living and dying more often than most people realized. Hwayeon rode at the back of the column. She had been quiet since Stormhaven, quieter than usual. Ihyeon watched her from the corner of his eye and saw a woman carrying a weight that had nothing to do with saddlebags or medical instruments. They reached Salinthra on the 15th day of the rotation. The city had changed, not physically, emotionally. The streets were louder. People moved with something in their step that had not been there before. The sound of infants crying was no longer cause for held breath and whispered prayers. It was just sound, normal and unremarkable and miraculous. Ihyeon was escorted to the palace. The council would meet the following morning to hear his report and plan the next rotation. He had 1 night. He used it. He went to the temple wing. He found Hwayeon in her sanctum, surrounded by scrolls and diagnostic crystals and the remnants of whatever she had been studying in his absence. She looked up when he entered. Her face was composed, but her eyes were tired. He sat across from her. He told her he was not there for a medical examination. He told her he knew about the letters. He told her he knew about the Order of the First Light. He told her Soa was very good at her job. Hwayeon went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone who had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. She asked him what he wanted to know. He said everything. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted. The careful, professional distance she had maintained since their first meeting was gone. In its place was exhaustion, raw and total and long overdue. She told him. She told him the waning was not a natural disaster and not a divine punishment and not an accident. It was created, deliberately and precisely, and with full knowledge of what it would do. She told him it was created by the first Empress, Solenn, the woman who had unified the 8 kingdoms 3 centuries ago, the woman whose name the empire bore. She told him Solenn had not died. The histories said she had. The temples taught that she had ascended to a higher plane after unifying the continent. That was a lie. Solenn was alive. She had been alive for 300 years, sustained by the same magic that had created the waning. She told him the Order of the First Light was Solenn's hidden hand within the temples, a network of priestesses who maintained the curse across generations. Hwayeon had discovered the order 15 years ago when she began studying the waning. She had been recruited, not by choice, by necessity. The order told her what the waning truly was and offered her a choice: join and work within the system to find a cure, or be silenced. She chose to join. For 15 years, she had searched for a way to undo the curse from inside the very structure that maintained it. She said she had failed every time until Ihyeon appeared. He asked her the question that mattered most. He asked her why Solenn had created the waning. Hwayeon told him. 3 centuries ago, the continent was drowning in war, kingdom against kingdom, army against army, men sending men to die in endless cycles of conquest and revenge. Solenn unified the 8 kingdoms, but she could not stop the violence. Within a generation of her unification, the wars resumed. She watched the peace she had built crumble, and she decided that the root cause was not politics or resources or territory. The root cause was a pattern of power that perpetuated itself through male dominance and military aggression. She decided to remove the pattern by removing its carriers. The waning was her solution. 50 years ago, she activated it, a curse that would kill men slowly across generations until the world rebuilt itself without them. She believed a world of women would find peace. Ihyeon asked if she was right. Hwayeon looked at him. She said the 8 queens had nearly gone to war 17 times in 50 years. She said the violence had not stopped. It had simply changed its vocabulary. She said Solenn was wrong. But Solenn did not believe she was wrong. And Solenn was still alive and still powerful and still watching. He asked about himself. Why was he immune? Hwayeon told him. Solenn was not a fool. She knew her experiment might fail. She built a failsafe into the curse, a second seal that would activate if the new world proved as broken as the old one. A living counterforce to the waning, born with the potential to undo everything she had done. Ihyeon was that seal. Not an accident, not a mutation, a designed element of the curse itself, placed in the world by the same hand that had tried to end it. He was Solenn's contingency plan, her admission that she might be wrong. He sat in the sanctum and felt the amber light pulse through his body with new understanding. He was not fighting the waning. He was its other half. The cure was built into the disease. The exit door was built into the prison. Solenn had created both the cage and the key, because somewhere beneath 3 centuries of conviction, she had known that a world without choice was no better than a world without peace. He asked Hwayeon one final question. He asked where Solenn was. Hwayeon told him, beneath the palace, beneath the Hall of 8 Thrones, in a chamber that had existed since the founding of the empire. She was there. She had always been there, watching, waiting to see what he would choose. He stood. The amber light was brighter than it had ever been, steady and burning and alive with purpose that finally had a name. He told Hwayeon to call the council. The council convened at midnight, not by protocol, by necessity. The 8 queens arrived in various states of interrupted sleep and barely concealed alarm. Mison was the only one who looked composed. Rahi had her sword. Gayn had arrived via lightning from the Storm Kingdom in under an hour. Yorin had not slept at all, and it showed only in the faint shadows beneath her eyes. Sebyeol came with a stack of books she had been reading when the summons reached her. Dani came from the kitchen. Soa was already there. Hwayeon stood beside Ihyeon at the center of the hall. She told them everything. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence Ihyeon had experienced in the Hall of Eight Thrones. Rahi broke it. She said she was going to find Solenn and put a sword through her. Mison told her to sit down. Yorin spoke with a voice stripped of all calculation. She said the strategic implications were beyond anything she had modeled for. She said if Solenn was alive and beneath the palace, then the entire power structure of the empire had been a puppet show for 3 centuries. Every queen, every crown, every war avoided, and every war fought, all of it under the eye of a woman who had decided the fate of an entire gender and called it mercy. Dani asked how many boys had died, not the historical estimate, the exact number. Hwayeon said the temple records documented approximately 2 million male deaths attributed to the waning over 50 years. Dani placed both hands flat on the table. She did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. The look in her eyes was enough. Sebyeol opened one of her books. She said she had found references to the founding chamber in the oldest imperial texts. They described it as a sanctum of perpetual magic, a place where the first empress meditated and maintained the unity of the empire. She said the text did not mention a curse. They spoke of a blessing. That was the official history, a blessing that unified the continent. She closed the book. She said history was written by the living, and the living could lie for 300 years if no one checked. Soa said she had suspected something beneath the palace for years. She said there were corridors her agents could not access, doors that opened to nothing, magical barriers that even her best infiltrators could not breach. She had attributed it to ancient security systems. She said she should have looked harder. Ikhyeon stood from her throne. She asked what the plan was. She said she did not care about history or politics or 300 years of lies. She said a boy named Suho had been born alive because of Ihyeon, and she was not going to let an immortal empress in a basement decide whether that boy lived or died. She asked Ihyeon what he needed. He told them. He said the waning and his power were 2 halves of the same creation. The curse could not be broken by force. It could not be lifted by decree. It could only be unmade by the same mechanism that made it. 2 seals, one of destruction, one of restoration. Solenn held the first. He carried the second. To end the waning permanently, he needed to descend to the founding chamber and confront Solenn. But his power ran on connection, on trust, on bonds that were genuine and freely given. He said one bond had doubled his radius. He looked around the room. 8 queens, 8 potential resonances. If all 8 connections were real, his power would be enough to match Solenn and unmake the curse. He said he was not asking them to fight for him. He was asking them to trust him. Rahi drew her sword and drove it into the table next to the old scar. She said she trusted him, and she would also be bringing her sword. Gayn said she was in, and everyone already knew that. Soa inclined her head once, which Ihyeon understood was the equivalent of a blood oath from the Queen of Shadows. Hwayeon placed her hand over her heart and said she had waited 15 years for this moment, and she was not leaving his side. Sebyeol stood. She was trembling, but her voice was steady. She said she had spent 10 years reading about a world she never got to live in. A world where boys and girls grew up together. Where her mother might have had a partner to share the weight of a crown. She said she wanted that world. She wanted it badly enough to stand here and shake and say yes anyway. Dani looked at him. She did not speak. She simply nodded. Once. The weight of 2 million deaths and one 11-day-old boy was in that nod. Mison was last. The elder queen studied him from her throne, with eyes that had seen more of the empire's machinery than anyone alive. She said she had spent her life maintaining balance. She said balance was not the same as justice. She said she had known for decades that something was wrong at the foundations of the empire, and she had chosen stability over truth because truth was dangerous, and stability kept people alive. She said she had been wrong. She said Ihyeon had shown her that stability built on a lie was just a slower kind of collapse. She stood. She said the council was unanimous. 8 queens, 1 voice. For the first time in the history of the Solenn Empire, Yorin had not spoken. Everyone turned to her. She sat in her throne with her fingers steepled and her dark eyes fixed on Ihyeon. The silence stretched. Then she lowered her hands. She said she had spent the last hour running calculations. Probability of success, risk assessment, resource allocation. She said every model she built predicted failure. The variables were too uncertain. The enemy was too old. The power dynamics were too unknown. She said her strategic recommendation was to retreat and plan and gather more information. She paused. Then she said her strategic recommendation was wrong. She said sometimes the correct answer was not the calculated one. She said she had learned that from a man who walked into a hurricane to help a woman he barely knew. She looked at Ihyeon. She said she was choosing option 3. He remembered the lighthouse, the wall she had built, the crack he had seen. She stood. The crack broke open. She said she trusted him, not his power, not his strategic value. Him. The amber light in Ihyeon's chest blazed, not gradually, all at once. 8 resonances, 8 bonds acknowledged in one room at one moment. The light poured from him in waves of gold that washed over the hall and touched every throne and every crown and every woman who had chosen to stand with a man who had nothing to offer but himself. The Hall of 8 Thrones hummed with a frequency that had not been heard in 300 years. Beneath their feet, far below the foundation, the ground trembled. Solenn knew they were coming. The entrance to the founding chamber was behind the imperial throne. Soa found it in under 10 minutes once she knew what to look for, a seam in the stone that responded to the touch of a crown bearer. Mison placed her hand on the wall and the stone slid apart, revealing stairs that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light. The amber glow from Ihyeon's chest pushed back the dark. Not far, enough to see the steps. They went down together, all 9 of them. Rahi took point with her greatsword drawn and her eyes scanning the shadows for threats that 3 centuries of paranoia had almost certainly prepared. Soa covered the rear. Gayn walked with her hands crackling. Hwayeon walked beside Ihyeon and her own power hummed in counterpoint to his. The stairs descended for a long time. The air grew colder. The walls changed from imperial stone to something older. Raw rock carved with symbols that Sebyeol recognized from the earliest texts. She told them the symbols were a language that predated the empire, pre-unification script. She could read fragments. The fragments said the same thing over and over. The world must be corrected. The world must be corrected. The world must be corrected. They reached the bottom. The founding chamber was vast, a cavern the size of the Hall of 8 Thrones above. At its center stood a pillar of crystallized magic, pure white, pulsing with the rhythm that matched a heartbeat. The waning. This was its source, the physical anchor of the curse that had killed 2 million boys and men over 50 years. And beside the pillar stood Solenn. She looked 40, dark hair streaked with white, a face that had been beautiful 3 centuries ago and had been preserved by magic into a mask that no longer fully resembled life. She wore robes of the first empress, white and gold and ancient. Her eyes were open and aware, and they held no surprise at all. She told them she had been expecting this. She told them she had been expecting this for 23 years, since the moment her failsafe was born in a mountain village and took his first breath. She looked at Ihyeon. She told him he had grown well. She said she had watched through the network of the order. She knew his mother's name. She knew his grandmother's name. She knew every herb he could identify and every silent step he had learned. She said she was proud of him. The word landed like a slap. Rahi raised her sword. Solenn looked at her. The air between them compressed, and Rahi slid backward 3 paces across the stone floor without Solenn moving a finger. The power difference was total. 3 centuries of accumulated magic against 8 queens who were strong but mortal, and a man whose fire burned bright but new. Solenn told them to listen. She said she would explain, and then they could choose. She said she had always intended for there to be a choice. Ihyeon told the queens to lower their weapons. They did. Reluctantly. Solenn spoke. She told them about the world before the waning. She told them about the wars that had consumed the continent for 1,000 years before her unification. She told them she had united the 8 kingdoms through force and diplomacy and sacrifice, and she had believed peace was possible. She held that peace for 250 years. Then it crumbled. The same patterns reasserted themselves. Territory, resources, pride, violence escalating until it threatened to undo everything she had built. She said she studied the patterns. She said every cycle of escalation was driven by the same structural incentive: a concentration of physical and political power in a demographic that was culturally rewarded for aggression. She said she tried education. She tried institutional reform. She tried cultural programs that spanned decades. Nothing held. The patterns were too deep. So she made a decision that she knew was monstrous and that she believed was necessary. She removed the variable. She created the waning to eliminate male influence from the continent over 2 generations. She said she expected the world that emerged to be imperfect. She said she did not expect it to be perfect. She expected it to be better. Yorin spoke. She asked if it was better. Solenn was quiet for a moment. She said it was different. She said the wars had not stopped. The violence had not stopped. The suffering had not stopped. It had changed form, changed vocabulary, changed the faces that carried it out. But the pattern survived because the pattern was not male. The pattern was human. Dani spoke for the first time since the council. She asked Solenn if she knew how many boys had died. Solenn said she knew the exact number. She said she knew every name. She said she had watched every death through the network. 2,117,412. She said each one was a weight she carried. She said she'd expected that weight to be worth it. She said she was no longer certain. Ihyeon stepped forward. The amber light intensified. The pillar of crystallized magic pulsed in response. 2 forces, 2 seals. One of destruction and one of restoration, face to face for the first time. He told Solenn that she had built a cage and called it salvation. He told her that she had taken the choice away from an entire world and decided for them what survival looked like. He said he understood her reasons. He said he even understood her pain. He said watching the world destroy itself and having the power to stop it and choosing to use that power was not evil. It was human, but it was wrong. She asked him what he would do differently. He told her he would not decide for others. He said the world she built was not better or worse. It was just a different shape of the same suffering. He said the only thing that had changed anything was not the removal of men or the elevation of women. The only thing that changed anything was the connections between people. Real ones, earned ones, built on trust and vulnerability and the willingness to see another person as a person and not a variable. He looked at the 8 queens standing behind him. He said these women had spent 50 years carrying a world on their shoulders, and they were exhausted, and they were strong, and they deserved the chance to build something with partnership instead of in isolation. He said the boys who would be born deserved the chance to grow up in a world that was not poisoned by the assumption that they were the problem. He said he was choosing to unmake the curse. He asked her if she would let him. Solenn looked at him for a long time. The pillar pulsed. The chamber hummed. 3 centuries of conviction and grief and terrible purpose moved behind her ancient eyes. She said she had built the failsafe because she knew she might be wrong. She said she had waited 23 years to see what kind of person her contingency would become. She said she had hoped he would be angry. Anger she could have dismissed. Righteousness she could have debated. But he had not come with anger or righteousness. He had come with empathy. And empathy was the one weapon she had never built a defense against. She stepped away from the pillar. She told him to do what he was made to do. Ihyeon placed his hands on the pillar. The crystal was cold, colder than mountain snow, colder than the deepest winter he had survived in Yeomra. The cold of the waning was the cold of absence. Life removed, warmth extracted. A curse that worked not by adding poison, but by subtracting something essential. He pushed his power into the crystal. The amber light met the white pulse, and the reaction was immediate and violent. Pain shot through his arms and into his chest. The 2 forces collided inside the pillar and inside him simultaneously. He was both the cure and the disease. Both seals activated at once. The pillar cracked, a sound like a mountain splitting. White light erupted from the fracture, and the chamber shook. Rahi braced herself against the wall. Gayn threw up a barrier of compressed air around the group. Hwayeon channeled healing energy toward Ikhyeon as his veins turned black with the curse trying to consume him from within. He held on. His fingers dug into the crystal, and his jaw locked, and his vision blurred, and the pain was beyond anything he had language for. The waning was not going to die quietly. It fought. 3 centuries of accumulated malice poured through the pillar and into the one person who could absorb it. Every death, every infant that turned blue, every father who withered, every mother who held a cooling body and screamed into the dark. 2,117,412 deaths trying to flow through one man. He could not hold it. His knees buckled. The amber light flickered. Hwayeon screamed his name, and her healing surged, but it was not enough. The curse was older and deeper, and it had been fed by centuries of grief, and it was swallowing him. Then Rahi placed her hand on his shoulder. She did not speak. Her grip was iron, the weight of a warrior who had held a sword for 19 years and had never once let go of anything she chose to hold. The resonance ignited. His fire found her steel, and the connection blazed. The pain did not lessen, but his strength doubled. Gayn grabbed his other shoulder. Lightning crackled through her fingers and into him, and the storm force joined the flame and the steel, 3 resonances burning. Hwayeon placed both hands on his back. Her healing poured into him, not as treatment, but as fuel. The golden light steadied. 4. Soa touched the back of his neck. Her fingers were cool and precise, and the shadow she commanded wrapped around the curse like chains, slowing its assault. 5. Sebyeol pressed her forehead against his arm. She was crying. Her tears were hot on his skin. Her power was not dramatic. It was the quiet strength of a girl who had carried a crown since childhood and never once dropped it. 6. Dani placed her hand over his heart, over the exact spot where the amber light originated. Her touch was warm and steady, the touch of a mother, the touch of a woman who had held a dying boy and survived the loss and still chose to love the world. 7. Yorin was last. She stood apart. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was a mask of calculation, crumbling in real time. Every model she had ever built said this should not work. Trust was not a quantifiable variable. Emotional bonds could not be converted into magical force. The numbers did not support what she was seeing. But the numbers were wrong. She had known they were wrong since the lighthouse. She stepped forward. She placed her hand on his, on the pillar, on the cold crystal that held the death of 2 million. She did not calculate the risk. She did not model the outcome. She trusted him. 8. The resonance completed. 8 bonds, 8 queens. 8 connections forged not through politics or power or desperation, but through the slow, patient work of a man who had spent his life learning to see people for who they truly were. The amber light exploded. Gold poured from the pillar in every direction. It raced through the chamber and up the stairs and through the palace and into the streets of Solenthra and beyond. Outward, expanding. A wave of warmth that crossed mountains and rivers and oceans and touched every corner of the continent of Ervin. The pillar shattered. White crystal fell like snow. The waning died in the same silence it had been born in. No thunder, no final scream, just a quiet end, a cessation, an absence of absence. Life returning to the spaces where death had lived for 50 years. Ihyeon collapsed. 8 pairs of hands caught him before he hit the ground. He lay on the cold stone of the founding chamber and looked up at 8 faces. Rahi, stern and tearless, and holding him like she would hold a fallen comrade. Gayn, with lightning still flickering in her hair and tears streaming down her face. Hwayeon, glowing with residual healing energy and smiling for the first time since he had known her. Soa, with shadows pooling around her feet and an expression of undisguised relief. Sebyeol, still pressing her forehead against his arm and whispering something he could not hear. Dani, with her hand on his heart and her eyes closed, and a peace on her face that looked like it had been waiting 11 years to arrive. Yorin, with her mask gone, simply gone. No ice, no calculation, just a woman looking at a man she had chosen to trust and finding that the world had not ended because of it. Mison standing above them all with silver hair and ancient eyes and the faintest smile he had ever seen on a human face. She said it was done. Solenn stood at the far wall of the chamber. The pillar was gone. Her curse was gone. 3 centuries of magic that had sustained her life and her purpose dissolved in a wave of golden light. She was aging, slowly but visibly. The white streaks in her hair spread. The lines on her face deepened. She looked at Ihyeon. She told him he was kinder than she deserved. He told her kindness was not about deserving. She nodded. She said she was tired. She said 300 years was long enough for anyone. She asked Hwayeon to care for her. Hwayeon rose from Ihyeon's side and went to the woman who had created the curse and the cure and the world they all lived in. She took Solenn's hand. The old empress leaned on the young priestess, and together they walked toward the stairs. Solenn paused at the bottom step. She looked back at the 8 queens gathered around one man on the floor of a chamber that had been the heart of a 3-century lie. She told them to do better than she did. Then she climbed the stairs and did not look back. They carried Ihyeon to the surface. The sun was rising over Solenthra. The city was waking. In the streets below, a woman screamed, not in terror, in shock. Her husband was standing in the doorway of their home, a man in his 60s who had been bedridden with the waning for 3 years. He was standing. The color had returned to his skin. He was alive and confused and alive. Across the continent, the same scene repeated in thousands of homes. Men woke from the slow death that had been consuming them. Infant boys who had been fading stabilized. Pregnancies that had been watched with dread became pregnancies watched with hope. The waning was over. Ihyeon stood on the balcony of the imperial palace and watched the sunrise. The 8 queens stood with him, not behind him, not around him, with him. Rahi on his left, with her sword sheathed for once. Yorin on his right, with her hands unclenched. Gayn leaning on the railing, with her face turned to the wind. Soa in the shadow of the archway, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Hwayeon had not returned from tending to Solenn. Sebyeol sat on the railing the way she had that night on the terrace. Dani stood quietly, with her eyes on the city below. Mison stood apart, watching not the sunrise, but the 8 of them. Rahi spoke first. She said, 50 years they had divided the continent into 8 pieces. She said, maybe it was enough. Maybe it was time to share something for once. Yorin said sharing required a framework. She said she would draft one. Gayn said she did not care about frameworks. She said she cared about the boy named Suho, who would grow up in a world where he did not have to hide. Soa said she would ensure the transition was monitored. She said old powers did not die easily, and the factions that had benefited from the waning would not surrender quietly. She said she looked forward to the work. Sebyeol said the consort position was still available in the imperial charter. She looked at Ihyeon. He looked back at her. He told her he was not ready for a title. She said she was not asking him to take one today. She was asking him to consider that the empire needed a center, and that the center did not have to be a throne. It could be a person. Dani said nothing. She reached over and straightened the collar of his coat. A small gesture. The gesture of a mother. The gesture of a woman who had lost her son and found that care did not end because loss began. Mison spoke last. She said the empire had survived on division for 50 years. She said survival was not the same as living. She said it was time to learn the difference. Ihyeon leaned on the railing. The amber light was still there, fainter now, steady. A warmth that no longer needed to blaze because the cold it had been fighting was gone. Below him, the city was waking into a world that had not existed yesterday. A world where boys could be born and live and grow. Where men could stand in doorways and breathe. Where 8 queens could look at each other across a balcony and see not rivals, but something that did not have a name yet, but was beginning to form. He thought about his mother in Yeomra. He would bring her here. She would walk in sunlight for the first time without fear. He thought about his grandmother, who had sung to him in a voice so low no one could hear. He would find a place where she could sing at full volume. He looked at the 8 women standing with him in the first light of a world without the waning. He did not know what came next. He did not know if the empire would hold together, or if old wounds would tear it apart, or if the factions Soa warned about would fight the change. He did not know if the feelings growing between him and these 8 remarkable women would become something lasting, or something that burned bright and faded. He did not know, and for the first time in his life, that was not frightening. For 23 years, he had been hidden because a boy was not allowed to live. Now, the hiding was over. The curse was broken. The sun was up. 8 queens stood beside him, and the continent of Ervin stretched out below them, waiting to be rebuilt by people who had finally chosen trust over fear. He took a breath, the deepest breath he had ever taken, and the morning was warm.